The creators at Grounded believe that brewing great coffee shouldn't be a shot in the dark, and we couldn't agree more. Use the coupon code TheCoffeePodcast for 10% off Grounded at groundedcoffeebook.com. Our friends at Map It Forward are hosting 2 events we think you might be interested in: how to map a successful career as a barista, and how to map a successful career in business as a coffee roaster. Use the coupon code TheCoffeePodcast for 10% off your ticket. Remember, you can attend virtually. The following conversation is a living continuum that includes every link of the coffee value chain, from before the seed to after the cup. I'm Jesse Hartman, and this is the Coffee Podcast. All this conversation about roasting, and we've yet to cover one of the fastest growing home hobbies in the coffee industry, home roasting. And here to kick us off on the conversation is a good friend of mine, Andy Snyder, who is a home roaster out in Austin, Texas. So hold on to your earbuds. You might just be surprised how easy it is to roast good coffee at home. Well, welcome, Andy. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jesse. This is fun.
So before we get started, let's hear your home roasting origin story, if you don't mind.
Origin story. Wow, that makes it sound so dramatic. The roasting part is actually the second piece of the story. The first part is actually the tasting, the first introduction to specialty coffee. And it's actually a little over 11 years ago now. I was teaching in a graduate school, and in my afternoon classes, I would always take a cup of coffee with me because my class was right after lunch, and you get the afternoon sleepies and you want a little caffeine. So I would always take a cup of coffee to the class with me. A couple of the students noticed this, and one of them came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm really into coffee, and we found this really good stuff here. Could I make you a cup before the next class? When we have class again the next time?" And I said, "Sure, that sounds great." So he made me a cup of coffee. Brought it to me, put it on the teaching desk out there, the podium or whatever you call it, and he said, "Now you want to let it cool for a few minutes because it's pretty hot and it'll taste better once it cools down a little bit."
Right.
And I said, "Okay, fine." So I left it sitting there, and I started class. And about 5 minutes into class, I took my first sip. Now, what he had made for me was an Ethiopian natural that had this really strong blueberry note to it. Like, really, even a totally inexperienced guy is going to immediately notice that. So I took my first sip of this coffee, and class came to a screeching halt because I had to find out, what is this? This is amazing. And so I asked him right there in class, "David, what is this? This is incredible." And so I found out that it was a coffee that was roasted by a company called Intelligentsia. And I had no idea what a dry process or natural coffee was at the time. I just knew at the time this was incredibly amazing. So I started doing research into, how can I get this coffee at my house, right? How can I make this at the office? And I looked at how much a bag of beans cost, buying it from Intelligentsia. They're in Los Angeles.
Right.
And I said, "Gosh, that would be great, but I can't afford to drink this coffee every day." So that's when, because I was drinking, stuff from the grocery store, right? It wasn't Folgers, but I thought it was fancy, from Trader Joe's or whatever. It had a country name on it. It's, "Hey, this is Colombian," or "This is Costa Rican." But it was all over roasted and oily and whatever. So I realized that I wasn't going to be able to afford a steady diet of Intelligentsia. And so that's when I was introduced to the concept of roasting at home, which again, I thought was just a really outlandish idea. So he told me, "No, it's actually really simple. You can get a certain kind of hot air popcorn popper, and you can actually just roast coffee at home." And so I started doing research on the internet, and sure enough, within about 6 weeks or so, I had my good old West Bend thrift store popcorn popper, and was already starting to think about how I could make modifications, to make it more efficient and
Right.
whatnot. And I was roasting coffee in the popcorn popper right there in my garage in less than 2 months.
Do you remember the size of the batches that you were doing?
Like 70 to 80 grams.
Right.
I think they were about 70 grams at first, but then once a couple more students, we actually started to grow this little home roasting community right there at the school where I was teaching. There were a few guys, and a few of us got together in my garage one day. We all brought our popcorn poppers together, and we got that, that article that's on Engadget.com about how to modify a popcorn popper. And we ripped our popcorn poppers apart, and we installed, switches and transformers, and
Nice.
we were controlling the fan speed and the heating element separately. And so once we did that, I think I got a batch size up to about 85
Wow. Yeah.
or so grams, because we could, hit the fan really hard. But then that got old pretty quick. Well, not too quick. I think I did that for about 3 years because the batch size is so small.
Mm-hmm.
And by that time, I was really beginning to love the results that I was getting, and it was, less than half the cost of buying commercially roasted specialty coffee.
Right.
We can talk about the quality at some point here, but the results were getting better, and so I decided that I decided I was going to buy a roaster for my home, and of course it took me a while because I had to get my wife on board with that idea.
Right.
There's a whole new level. I was buying popcorn poppers for $5 at the thrift store.
Right.
But now I want to spend $800 or $900 on a drum roaster.
Right. You kind of have to lay it out and make sense of the purchase, right?
So what I had to do was get up my coffee game, my roasting game, to the point where my wife really loved the coffee. Then I could say, all right, honey, if we're going to continue this, really, in order to be efficient, we really need to have our own roaster. So that's what we did.
Smart. Yeah, it sounds like you took a pretty smart approach there. And it does sound like the reason you went into home roasting was primarily sort of the cost value, right? Of saying, hey,
yeah, that's what pushed me over the edge. Now, I was fascinated by the concept that I could roast coffee at home and that it could be great coffee. So I'm a curious guy. I like to try new things, and I don't know. Maybe I was looking for a hobby, and this seemed like a good fit. So once I got into it, I realized there's skill to be learned. There's art. There's science, and I'm kind of into that. So I enjoyed the process very much. I didn't do it just because I wanted to save money. But the truth is, once you make the leap into really good coffee, you just can't go back, or at least I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that it eventually became sort of an act of desperation. I can't go back to drinking the stuff from the grocery store. How am I going to? And I can't afford back at that point it was the biggest game in town. Right. I can't afford those guys. So how am I going to handle this? And this seemed to be the best way forward. And then it became kind of a challenge, right? Can my roast rival the good stuff that I'm getting at these various coffee shops in the LA area? So it was a good challenge. So it made for a good hobby.
So you made the point that you had to convince your wife that, hey, this is a good idea, and you kind of upped your game. I assume that with all that effort, choosing the actual equipment that you're going to use and spending, that $800 or so was that was an important decision. So what did choosing your equipment look like? What was that process like? And why did you choose what you did?
Okay. So I ended up with a hot top, the drum roaster, not the highest end one, the one that it's a little more manual. It has 2, 3, preset programs that you can modify. It's not the one with all the extra goodies in the controls. And that was 7 years ago. I think I roasted with popcorn poppers for 2 to 3 years. So I can't remember the year, but so I ended up with a hot top drum roaster. So there were a couple of things there. I looked at all the different kinds, and at first I was headed toward an air roaster, more like like a Fresh Air or one of those guys, and because it was similar to what I was already accustomed to, the hot air roasting method. But the more I got into it, the more I saw, and again, I feel like I got to make a disclaimer at the beginning that being a guest here sort of makes me an expert. I'm only an expert in my in my own little world here, and I mean I got a bunch of friends and people that are into coffee, and some of them roast, and some of them work in coffee, and so forth. But I feel like I'm the farthest thing from an expert. But
Right
this was a
on.
little bit of a thought process, at least as far as I can remember it. I wanted to get as close to commercial drum roasting, specialty coffee roasting as I could. And in my reading, my research at the time, from various websites, various sources, um, and then talking to people who had a couple of different kinds of roasters, it seemed like getting a mini drum roaster like the Hot Top would position me to mimic as best as I could what I was getting in the coffee shops in the LA area where I lived
Yeah,
at the time.
that makes sense.
So so that's why I did what I did. Um, so I looked at all the big guys, all the big names, at least the ones at the time, in both drum roasting, hot air roasting. I looked at like the stovetop method, where you stir them in a stovetop popcorn popper.
Hmm.
And I mean, again, I have zero interest in standing there and cranking that thing. Part of it was convenient. I want, I
Yeah.
want something that's going to work for me a little more than the popcorn popper did. And it didn't seem like stovetop roasting was a step forward in that category. It seemed like it was a lateral move or even a step back. And I was concerned about the evenness there. Plus, I kind of had an agreement that I wouldn't create a lot of mess and smoke inside the house.
Right.
And I mean, I didn't really want that. I mean, my wife didn't either, but um, I didn't want to do that. It's nice. I think it's nice to do it in the garage where the mess doesn't matter so much and it's easy to
Mm.
clean up and so forth. So, yeah, so I think that was pretty much the thought process at the time.
Got you. So, you had actually mentioned there are kind of a few. I think the main three kinds of roasters that there are for home roasting are going to be the air, the drum, and the stovetop. So, it sounds like you considered all of those, but you ended up going with the drum because it was the best sort of replica, the best way for you to replicate what you were experiencing in the cup.
Yeah.
With coffees that you enjoyed. And then there's a convenience factor too.
Right, for sure. And there's also with the Hot Top, it has it really is a mini commercial roaster where it's got the ejection method that drops it into a cooling tray that has an automatic stirring paddle and so forth. So the whole thing is self-contained. With air roasting, the idea is you got to dump it out somewhere and cool it in a separate place. Is not, or at the time was not super appealing to me, or the idea that you have to cool it down inside the machine, whether it's an air machine and the element goes off and it blows cold air, or another kind of drum like the Baymore, where it has to cool down inside the machine, or is at least it's built to cool down inside the machine, which
Mm-hmm.
I think kind of messes with the way I'm perceiving the roasting curve. Hot Top just seemed to have the right combination of things that I thought would help me to, mimic the roasting that the big boys can do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right on. So, you can't roast coffee without any beans, or seeds rather, depending on who you ask. And so where did you get your beans from at the beginning? How did you even, you're going to go buy a roaster, a home roaster. How difficult or how easy was it for you to find a source for green?
So it was super easy because my friends that introduced me to specialty coffee also introduced me to Sweet Maria's.
Right on.
And Sweet Maria's was like this. It was this whole world. It was this beautiful online world. Again, I'm an information guy, a reading guy, I'm a book guy, I'm a research guy. And so Sweet Maria's offered me this library of information, not just a source to buy beans. Because, I get on a website like Sweet Maria's as a newbie, and I look at, they've got dozens of different beans from different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
How do I choose?
Right.
Like, what am I going to, and then when I get into roasting, how many pounds of coffee am I going to destroy just because I'm learning how to roast by sheer trial and error?
Mm-hmm.
So they had all of this great information about the science of roasting, like what's happening to the bean. And I mean, those guys are hilarious. Tom is a stitch, man, and he makes some of the coolest videos. One of my favorite videos is where he puts one coffee bean on this little tiny, like he bent a paper clip to make this tiny little holder
Mm-hmm.
for a single coffee bean, and he put it in a toaster oven, and then put on macro lens and recorded video of the whole thing. It's a time lapse, I can't remember.
It's so
you
that's
can watch the progression of the roast on just this one bean, and it's absolutely hilarious. But at the same time, it's really instructive. So that's just one example, and they're not paying me to say any of this.
right.
They don't know me from Adam. But I love those. It's not just because it's a source for good greens. It's a source for so much helpful information
Mm-hmm.
on the selection, the roasting, and brewing of coffee. And then, of course, they sell the beans, and they sell lots of brewing and roasting accessories. If I remember correctly, I think I bought my roaster from them.
Yeah,
so
they're kind of like a one-stop shop, right?
They really are. And when I think of it that way, I begin to think, well, maybe I'm missing out on something. I need to, compare and try some other sources for green coffee. But and then I think, man, if I buy a 5-pound bag of green coffee from this other source, whatever it might be, I don't have any one in mind, and it turns out to be like really terrible, then I'm stuck with this 5-pound bag. What do I do? What do I do with this? I've wasted all that money.
Right.
So anyway, I have once or twice gotten coffee from other sources, and it was okay. No complaints there. But it's Sweet Maria's has been so consistent at sourcing great coffee, at giving lots of information about their sources. Because they visit a lot of these farms, these
Mm-hmm.
co-ops, washing stations all over the world, and get to know. So I feel like there's good trade practices going on, good quality from the farm all the way to my roaster, and so I just keep going with it. It's and I continue to learn from them.
Well, right on. So there's, you're going to have your preferences on what kind of coffees you like. What is your process of, like, how do you choose your coffees that you're going to roast at home through Sweet Maria's? What does that process look like?
No, I was going to say it's semi-random, but it's not. I definitely have the certain origins that I really like. I really like Guatemalan coffee, from certain regions in Guatemala. I like Kenya. I'm always a little nervous. I feel like it's so easy to ruin a lot of Kenyan coffees, but I love a well-roasted Kenyan coffee. I like, and then there's certain things I don't like. I know for sure that most Brazilian coffees don't really do much for me, so I really don't generally buy greens from Brazil. Most Indonesian coffees, except for PNG, Papua New Guinea, I'm not into the earthy, rustic stuff, from Java, Sumatra, so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That's just not my preference. And I experimented with those a good bit in my earlier roasting days. And in the end, it's like, no, I tend to like Centrals and Africans the most. But often when I place a coffee, so I buy coffee about every 2 months or so, and I'll buy 15 to 20 pounds. So I'll usually buy a few 5-pound bags because there's a great price break between 2 and 5 pounds. The per pound cost goes down a good bit when you get 5 pounds instead of 1 or 2. So I'll buy a few 5-pound bags, and then I'll buy a couple of 1 or 2 pound bags of something that I just want to try. So in my last order, for instance, I got a pound of coffee from India because honestly, I didn't even know they grew coffee in India.
Right.
And so, so they had some advertised there on Sweet Maria's website. And I said, hey, let's try it. And so I got a pound of that to see what it would be like. Um, so I definitely have preferences that center on the Central American, mostly like Guatemala and Costa Rica and Honduras and Salvador, depending on how their crops are this year, and then I kind of rotate through East Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi.
So it sounds like your limitations are really just your palate, right? It's what you prefer, which is kind of insane if you think about how accessible the green coffee is to a home roaster. I just thinking about that just sounds insane.
It's crazy. Yeah, and there are so many choices. I can, and I'm only looking at one website. I know there are a number of them out there, but Sweet Maria's will have a dozen coffees, 8, 10, maybe a dozen coffees from Ethiopia at any one time, and it's awesome, and they're like fresh. I forget what the industry term is, but they're the most recent crop.
Yeah.
I can look at stuff that just arrived. I can buy stuff that just arrived last month. So it's cool.
Do they have options, Andy, to sample a coffee before you purchase? Is that a opportunity, or do they not do that?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I don't know.
I'm just curious.
They seem like super cool people. I bet that if I lived in Oakland, I could walk up to their warehouse and
just say, "Hey, can I have a sample?"
I don't know. I did visit there once when I was in Oakland on business, and I placed this huge order because I drove there. I lived in Southern California, and I drove up there for a meeting or something. And so I placed this huge order, got together with 4 friends or something, and bought a whole bunch of coffee, and I just picked it up.
Nice.
Didn't have to pay for shipping. It was pretty awesome.
That is awesome. So, we've talked about where you get your coffee, how you choose your coffee, and now we haven't really talked about the process. And I know that you said, hey, I'm not an expert on this necessarily, but that's kind of the beauty of home roasting, I feel, is like, it's something that you picked up, that you're passionate about. And that, I've tasted the coffee that you've roasted, and it's delicious. So it's like, it's accessible, right? It's possible to roast coffee at home that's delicious. So Andy, what does your process look like? And can you kind of step by step, just talk us through? Because part of me just really wants to bring out, there's a level of simplicity, and I'm not saying that there's not like a serious effort involved in a learning curve, but I just want our listeners to kind of understand that it's not maybe as complicated as it might sound.
Yeah. It's not rocket science at all. And again, the hot top provides a level of consistency and repeatability that I really value. I value both the art and the science of the process, and I especially value the science because once I've kind of arted my way into a roast that I really like, then I want to be able to repeat that.
Right.
So so I appreciate that about the hot top. It's less susceptible to ambient temperature. So anyway, I generally will roast a 250 gram batch, so about a half a pound at a time. I usually roast 3 to 4 batches per week. And just because I tend to have a kind of a busy life, I try to do all my roasting on one day, like a Saturday morning. So in order to do consecutive roasts like that, you have to, at least I have found, it's better to cool the machine all the way down before you start a new roast cycle. And so that requires a little extra time. Mm-hmm. So I'll spend an hour and a half or so. It's about 30 minutes per batch total time, with a roast time of about 13 minutes. So 12 and a half to 14 minutes, somewhere in there, depending on the bean and what I'm trying to do with it. So I'll spend an hour and a half to 2 hours, whether it's all in one block or spread out at different times of the day, depends on a lot of factors that have nothing to do with coffee.
Right.
But so I'll start in the morning. If it's cooler, in the garage, then it's easier to cool the machine down, and I can crank more batches out in a little bit less time. I did a good bit of research some years ago, just reading on the internet what other people were doing with their hot top roasters in terms of getting the roast started and so forth. So what I do is I start the preheat cycle, and I do have I have 2 saved programs that I have in there that I just kind of modify for whatever bean I'm roasting. I just modify it manually. So heat the roaster up. It starts to beep, and it wants you to charge the roaster to drop the beans in at 167 degrees, 169 degrees, something like that. But I don't. I wait until it gets up to about 220 before I drop the beans in.
Okay.
I can't get into a scientific discussion of why I do that.
You just know that the coffee turns out better, right?
It's better. Yeah, it just works better. And, the first 5 minutes or so are pretty static. When it gets up to about 185, 190, it's time to, you're at the drying phase and you want all the moisture to be out of there. And so we turn the fan on full for a period of time. I don't remember how long it is, but it's between 185 and 305 to make sure that it's fully dried. And then the fan goes off and we let it heat up. And then as it approaches 355, again, depending on the bean and what I'm trying to do with it, then start to back the heat off a little bit in preparation for first crack, so that I don't, run into it too fast. And then depending on what level of roast I'm trying to do, we just work with the airflow and the heat, varying the heat, so that I can kind of coast it in just to the end of first crack or just after first crack if I'm going for just a little more than that. I don't really do any dark roasts. I don't have a good espresso machine at home, so I don't even try to roast espresso.
Right.
And I've done that a little bit, and it's a whole different ballgame. So that's something I haven't mastered yet. Anyway, and then once I'm at the place where I needed to be, I eject, and the hot top has a cooling tray that has a fan underneath it and a stirring paddle, and that's great. And depending on circumstances, ambient temperature, and how successful I think I was at landing the roast where I wanted it to, I have another fan sitting next to my roaster that I'll turn on to kind of help with the cool down. And then I clean the roaster out, and because it's in the garage, I got my shop vac right there, so I just take the chaff tray out, take off the drum lid, and vacuum out all the chaff while it's cooling down.
Right now,
open her up and let her cool down.
You have this process, and the reason you chose the roaster you did is kind of because it's doing the work for you in a sense, right? And you're not having to run around doing all these different tasks. It's kind of like you said, even moments of it are static of the roasting process, which I think is typical in a roasting situation, even for roasters.
And it's just way less stressful, man. Roasting in a popcorn popper is great. And actually, I've coached a number of people through getting started with roasting with popcorn popper, and a few of them have gone on. They fall in love with it. They buy a Baymore or some other roaster, and then a couple of them will say, "Nah, this is too much trouble. I'm not going to do this."
Yeah, so that's a good starting spot then for people.
Yeah. Oh, it is.
Who are interested.
It's great because it's cheap. I mean, even if you buy a brand new popper, you're still only paying like $30-$40, I think.
Right.
But I was buying them, but this is back in the day when you could still get them in thrift stores, and I was getting them literally for $5-6 a piece.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But it's just really stressful way to roast. Once you kind of know what you're doing, it's so manual, which has its upsides, but also has the downside of it takes so much active participation.
Right. Well, thanks to Andy, we've had our eyes open to the world of home roasting. But that's not the end of our journey on this topic. Join us on the next episode as we finish our conversation with Andy and we have a surprise guest. You'll never guess who the surprise guest is on the topic of home roasting. The Coffee Podcast is produced by me, Jesse Hartman. Music is by Michael Parallax. You can find his music at michaelparallax.com. So thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.